Every morning, half the planet pours a dark liquid into a cup and drinks it before anything else. You probably did too. Now imagine being told that this ordinary modern ritual of yours was, 400 years ago, condemned by the Catholic Church as the bitter invention of Satan, and that the only reason you can drink it today is that a pope, pressured to ban it, took one sip and changed his mind. That's the legend almost everyone repeats. The legend is wrong, but not in the way you might expect. The church was not the first to try. The drink was not first condemned as satanic. And the Pope's famous blessing was not the moment coffee became safe. To see the real story, you have to start 100 years before the Vatican ever smelled a cup. The year is 1511. Mecca is filling with strangers who share cups of a dark new drink and linger in rooms where nothing is sold but conversation. The governor of the city, Khair Beg, watches from his window. He does not see heresy, he sees organization. Men meet in these new coffee houses every evening, and by morning, they have drafted petitions about taxation, about succession, about his rule. The drink itself is not the problem. The problem is what men do when they drink it together. Beg orders the coffee houses shut. He burns beans in the streets. He has drinkers beaten in public. The first coffee ban in recorded history is not a Christian decree against an infidel drink. It is a Muslim governor afraid of a public room where his own opposition is organizing in front of him. But coffee did not arrive in Mecca as a foreign vice. It had been a Muslim habit for more than a century before Beg's crackdown. Sufi mystics in Yemen had been brewing the beans since at least the 15th century, using the drink to stay awake through their night-long devotions, the kind of long prayer session where wine would have been inappropriate. Around 1454, the Mufti of Aden, Jamal al-Din al-Dabani, publicly endorsed the drink after trying it himself, and from there, it spread up the Hijaz. By the time of Beg's crackdown, the bean had been roasted in Cairo, in Damascus, in the holy cities, and the room it produced had become a fixture of intellectual life. That is precisely what makes it dangerous. Within a few years, the Ottoman Sultan Selim I, after conquering Egypt in 1570s, overturns the ban. Then the Ottoman authorities, having absorbed the region, reinstate it. The pattern repeats. Cairo in 1532, Mecca again. Constantinople in 1543, when the chief cleric Ebu Suud Effendi issues a formal fatwa. Shiploads of beans are rowed out into the harbor and dumped into the sea. But the drink keeps coming back. It resurfaces in Cairo, in Aden, in Damascus. A Persian doctor writing in 1611 will urge the next governor to suppress it for the great glory and abundant rewards it would bring him. The governor will not succeed. By the time Christian Europe encounters coffee, Muslim authorities have fought 3 rounds against it. The reasons have almost nothing to do with Satan. They have almost everything to do with who gets to speak in public, and how long they get to stay awake while doing it. Coffee arrives in Venice by the late 16th century, carried in the holds of merchant galleys that have been trading with the Ottoman ports for decades. The Venetians themselves have been drinking it for some time. Brokers who work the Rialto can be found at their cups well into the afternoon. Long-distance merchants have brought back beans from Cairo and Aden. A merchant family that cannot get its coffee is a merchant family with no energy to argue its contracts. The drink is already useful, and the city knows it. What bothers local clergy is not the drink itself, but the rooms it creates. By the 1580s and 90s, coffee houses have appeared in the back streets near the markets, and they are not like taverns. A tavern serves wine and closes at curfew. A coffee house serves cups of dark liquid and stays open as long as customers want to talk. In those rooms, Muslim merchants and Christian converts sit shoulder to shoulder. Students from the universities share tables with men who have never read a book. They stay awake past midnight. They argue about taxes, about the Pope, about the wars in Hungary and the price of grain. And they are doing it in a republic that does not entirely control what gets said. So the clergy do not draft their petition in the language of politics. They draft it in the language they have. They call the drink the bitter invention of Satan. They call it a Muslim substitute for the Eucharistic wine, the sacred blood of Christ that cannot be replaced by an infidel's brew. They call it foreign, dark, and capable of inflaming the passions in ways that wine, at least, has the decency to dull. The petition demands that the Pope intervene, that the drink be formally condemned, that no Christian conscience be left in doubt about whether the cup in his hand is a communion or a corruption. The petition climbs the road toward Rome. The phrase travels because it is reusable. Anyone who finds a coffee house suspicious can borrow it. Bitter invention of Satan, drink of infidels, banned by the faithful. But it has been borrowed. The exact same fear, dressed in slightly different language, has already cost Khair Beg his post in Mecca, has already emptied Ebu Suud Effendi's fatwa into the Bosphorus, has already closed coffee house after coffee house across the Ottoman Empire. The Catholic clergy are not inventing a new anxiety. They are importing an old one and giving it a Roman accent. What they import is the diagnosis, but not the cause. The diagnosis is that coffee corrupts. The cause in every Muslim capital that has already fought this fight was that coffee organizes. By the time the petition reaches the Vatican, the original political complaint has been repackaged as a theological one. The anxiety is older than the word Satan attached to it. The theology is the costume, and the costume in Rome is what gets remembered. Clement VIII is not the kind of pope you argue with. Between 1592 and his death in 1605, he presides over the execution of Giordano Bruno, who was burned at the stake in the Campo de' Fiori in 1600 for a long list of theological heresies, including heterodox cosmological views about the stars and the universe. He continued restrictive policies against Jewish communities in the Papal States, briefly expelling Jews from papal territories in 1598 and tightening existing restrictions. The Roman ghetto and the yellow badge requirement had been established decades earlier by Pope Paul IV. He commissions the official Latin Bible of the Catholic Church, the Clementine Vulgate, published in November 1592. He backs the French Catholic League against Henri of Navarre, then accepts Henri's conversion and crowns him King of France. He is, in short, a man of doctrine who sometimes bends when politics demand it, but does not bend on what he considers settled. When his advisors bring him a cup of the drink that Venetian clergy want condemned, they are bringing it to a man who has already signed execution orders and is not in the habit of refusing them. Bruno had been burned only a few years earlier. The burnings were not rhetorical. They were set pieces, attended by the Roman crowds, and Clement had personally approved the sentence. A pope who could look at a man on the pyre and not blink is not the kind of pope who overturns his clergy on the strength of a pleasant smell. According to the legend, the scene that follows is the pivot of the whole story. Clement takes the cup, he sips, he pauses. Then, in the version everyone quotes, he declares that the drink is too delicious to leave in the hands of infidels, that it would be a sin to abandon such a gift, that the only honest move is to take it for Christendom. He baptizes the beverage into the faith, the way missionaries were then baptizing entire peoples with a sprinkling of water and a Latin phrase. From that moment, coffee is religiously safe, and a Venetian priest who refuses to drink it is, quietly, out of step with Rome. The scene is irresistible, and that is the problem. There is no primary source, no contemporary letter, no Vatican memorandum, no diary entry from Clement's household records the moment. The famous quote, that it would be a pity to let the infidels monopolize so delicious a thing, appears in no identifiable document before the 20th century. The date of the supposed decision shifts between sources, 1600 in some, the early 1600s in others, 1615 in one outlier. The earliest serious coffee chronicle, written by the Sufi scholar Abd al-Qadir al-Jaziri in 1587, mentions nothing about a papal tasting. The first detailed European account of coffee, by the Maronite scholar Antoine Faustus Nyron, was published in Rome in 1671, and it tells the legend of the dancing goats in Ethiopia, not the story of a pope with a cup. So what is left when the sources are stripped is a feeling. That feeling has been useful. It has been useful to the Catholic Church, which gets a clever pope, a victory of discernment over prejudice. It has been useful to the coffee industry, which gets a papal endorsement, and which still repeats the legend in its marketing material. It has been useful to anyone who wants the origin story to end cleanly. One wise man, one fragrant sip, one happy ending. The legend survives because it is satisfying. The history survives because it is messy. They are not the same thing, and pretending they are has cost us the more interesting story. The story of what actually happens when a drink that makes people think together meets every kind of authority that would rather they did not. What happens, as the 17th century will show, is that the authorities keep losing. Coffee survives Rome. By the early 17th century, the first coffee houses have opened across Italy and France, and the religious charge against the drink fades. But the rooms where people drink it do not fade. They become something nobody has a name for yet. A public space where anyone with a coin can sit for hours, read a pamphlet, and argue with strangers about anything. The church has lifted its objection. The state is about to discover what the church should have feared. In Istanbul, this is already dangerous. Sultan Murad IV comes to the throne in 1623 at the age of 11, after years locked in the cafes, the royal apartment where Ottoman heirs were kept, sometimes for decades, waiting to see if their turn would come. The young sultan emerges traumatized and suspicious. He has already seen his brother Osman II strangled by janissaries in 1622. He rules through the threat of personal violence. His court lives in fear of his moods, and his mood in the early 1630s is murderous. On September 2nd, 1633, a fire breaks out in the Sabali district and burns through 1/5 of Constantinople, leaving tens of thousands homeless. Murad uses the disaster as a pretext. He declares the fire divine punishment for the city's vices, and chief among those vices is the coffee house, where janissaries, the elite military corps that has toppled sultans before, meet and plot. The ban comes down. According to Ottoman folklore, Murad himself prowls the streets at night in disguise, broadsword at his side, and kills anyone caught with a cup. The killings are widely repeated in popular accounts. Ottoman historians treat the Sultan's personal appearances with more caution. Whether or not he walked the alleys himself, the message was clear. Coffee was now a capital offense, and the men who served it were marked. It would take another 19 years, but the same drink was about to make the same kind of trouble in a colder, more literate city. In 1652, a servant named Pasqua Rosé, described in some sources as Greek or possibly from Ragusa, working for a Levant company merchant named Daniel Edwards, opens a stall in St. Michael's Alley, Cornhill, and begins selling coffee to English customers. He is not a nobleman. He is a foreigner with a recipe and a pamphlet he has written himself, The Virtue of the Coffee Drink, possibly the first piece of coffee marketing in England. The stall is small, the cups are wooden, and the customers are sailors and Levant traders who have tasted the drink in Smyrna and miss it. Within 11 years, there are 83 coffee houses in London. Within 23, there are thousands. They are called penny universities because for the price of a cup, you can hear the day's arguments from the smartest men in the country. Insurance is calculated in one of them, Lloyd's, which becomes Lloyd's of London. The stock market moves out of another. Royal Society members met in another. Though the society itself was formally founded at Gresham College, its fellows frequently gathered at coffee houses to discuss the day's work. And they are loud about politics. By the 1670s, the coffee houses of London have become nerve centers for the Whig opposition, the faction still seething over the execution of Charles the Firngern in 1649, and suspicious of the restored Stuart monarchy. Charles II has been back on the throne for 15 years, but he has not been forgiven. Pamphlets printed in the coffee houses call his brother James a papist and his mistress a whore. Plans for excluding James from the succession are debated over cups in the company of men who can write them down. Satirists publish a pamphlet called the Women's Petition Against Coffee, complaining that the drink has made their husbands impotent. The pamphlet is almost certainly written by a man, and probably by a coffeehouse defender mocking his critics. On December 23, 1675, Charles II signs the proclamation for the suppression of coffeehouses. The charge is not that the drink is satanic. The charge is that false, malicious, and scandalous reports are devised and spread abroad to the defamation of His Majesty's government. The drink corrupts nothing. It clarifies too much. The very men whose business it is to know what the country is thinking are sitting in rooms where the country's thinking is happening. The proclamation is supposed to take effect on January 10th. By January 8th, the crown has folded. Coffeehouse keepers have petitioned, pointing out the revenue the crown itself collects from coffee sales. More importantly, the coffeehouses have proven so useful to so many professions, to merchants, to insurers, to shipowners, to the Royal Society, that suppressing them looks less like order and more like panic. Charles withdraws the proclamation. He has discovered, like Khair Beg before him and Murad IV after him, that you cannot ban a public room where the people who run the country are talking to each other. The drink did not change. The threat did. In Mecca, in Venice, in Rome, in Istanbul, in London, the same cup kept producing the same problem for the same kind of ruler. Men awake, men talking, men thinking in the same room. The only thing that varied was which authority was first to notice, and how long it took them to give up. The drink in your cup has not changed in 4 centuries. What changed every generation was who felt threatened by it. In Mecca, it was a governor watching his opposition organize in rooms he could not control. In Venice, it was clergy translating political fear into theology because theology was the only language they had for it. In Rome, it was a legend that gave everyone a clean ending they could repeat. In Istanbul, it was a traumatized sultan who had watched his brother die. In London, it was a restored king who had watched his father die and decided no pamphlet was worth another civil war. The legend of the Pope's baptism survives because it lets the conversion feel simple. The real history is messier. Coffee won not by being baptized, but by becoming too useful, too clarifying, and too widespread to ban. It became the room where merchants settle accounts, where science is debated, where the day's news is made into opinion. It became, in the long run, more important to keep open than to close. The authorities kept trying. They kept losing. The cup in your hand is the long-term verdict of the 4 authorities who tried to suppress coffee: the governor of Mecca, the Ottoman chief cleric, the Pope's own advisors, and the King of England. Which one had the most defensible case? Mecca was afraid of organized opposition. Rome was afraid of theological confusion. Istanbul was afraid of janissary plots. London was afraid of pamphlets. Drop your answer in the comments. And if you want more origin stories where the popular version turns out to be the wrong version, subscribe and come back tomorrow.